joined UN Habitat in 1995. I was recruited into the gender unit, what is now the gender unit, but at that time it was called the Women in Human Settlements Development Program, which is a very long name for a program and a bit of a mouthful, which actually led to the change of the name to Women and Habitat Program. Another reason why the change of name came about, apart from it being a long mouthful, is that when you are translating into the name into Spanish or French, there was always some issues about translation. But then we found that Women and Habitat was actually very easy. And the Women and Habitat name was actually suggested by some of our partners in Latin America. That program eventually, then later, a gender unit was introduced into UN Habitat, which was part of the gender policy, and the idea was to separate the focus on women and the gender mainstreaming per se. In reality, it became very difficult to distinguish in terms of operational and thematic focus between the gender unit and the Women and Women and Habitat program, and it created confusion. So in the end, they were remerged, and then they became the gender unit, which then dealt with human settlements, and women in human settlements, specific focus, and gender mainstreaming within the work of UN Habitat and the work of our partners. That was 1995 until 2001. In 2001, I was partly assigned to the Istanbul +5 Secretariat, but I was still in the gender unit. I was supposed to be working 75% in the Istanbul +5 Secretariat, because that was a very, very hectic preparation, and the lead time to the special session, which was in June 2001, was very short. In reality, it's very difficult to be in two programs and doing 25% in one and 75% in another. In the end, you end up actually doing more like 150 because you have responsibilities in both. That said, for me, the link between the two, my having worked in the gender unit and my working in the Istanbul +5 Secretariat was quite useful, because that is when you are reviewing how far governments, member states have implemented the habitat agenda. And of course, one of the points of focus was social inclusion, which also included gender. So it was quite interesting with my gender background and with interaction with a lot of the women's networks with whom I've been working in the gender unit to contribute to having the gender perspective in the Istanbul +5 process, and also in the final outcome of that. To go back to the gender unit, when I joined in 1995, my first job, why I was recruited, I came from the civil society sector, and I was actually recruited to mobilize the input of women's networks and women's organizations into the Istanbul process, that is the 1996 conference, and into putting the gender input into making sure that the habitat agenda, which was the outcome document of the Istanbul conference, had a gender perspective. I think it is generally agreed that the habitat agenda is a very good document as far as gender mainstreaming is concerned. It captured both the focus on women, affirmative action, and gender mainstreaming per se quite well. Then working in the Istanbul +5 Secretariat, which was reviewing how far the habitat agenda had been implemented, it was interesting to see from the national reports what governments had done better than others, what concrete measures had been taken to mainstream gender issues into human settlements development within countries. And it was interesting because some of the countries that had done very well, reflecting back, were some of the countries that had been very helpful and very supportive in getting the gender perspective into the habitat agenda in the first place. The other thing that was interesting in the Istanbul +5 Secretariat work that linked to the original Istanbul conference was to see countries that had had either had new constitutions since 1996 and had somehow have been affected, been influenced by the habitat agenda in the recognition of housing as a basic human right, and also countries that had either made a new housing policy or an urban development policy or revised their old one, reflecting the habitat agenda. In 2001, the Istanbul +5 special session was held in New York, and then that work was over. So then I went back to full-time into the gender unit until the middle of 2002, when there was a major reorganization in UN Habitat that was termed as regularization. It stemmed from having had a lot of people on the staff who were on, at that time, what was 200 series contracts, and there was sort of like almost like a hierarchy of staff who was regularly recruited and who was not so regularly recruited. We had a situation where staff came in, let's say, as short-term staff, and then was somehow renewed and renewed and renewed. So we had like a major overhaul of recruiting. And in that process, I left the gender unit and joined the best practices program, which at the time when I joined had 4 staff members. Milestones is at one level, I guess it's a subjective term because it's a question of perspective. And I have actually been thinking about this, and I don't know what are milestones, depending on what we look at. Vancouver, of course, they are the obvious ones. Vancouver, that was the basis for establishing UN Habitat. Then there was, incidentally, I forgot to mention that I actually worked in UN Habitat before, from 1981 to 1984, when the office was at Kenyatta International Conference Center. At that time I was working in a support category. I think I was GS4, GS6. The grades were different in those days. And my job was I was actually helping to compile a bibliography on low-cost, appropriate building materials. At that time, Habitat, why I remember this is at that time Habitat was doing a lot of work on the ground, a lot of operational work on the ground, actually building houses, helping countries to build housing. And we were also doing what was then the research, it was called Research and Development Division, was doing a lot of support to appropriate technology for building and construction. So then at that time I was also looking at a lot of documents when I was doing that bibliography, a lot of documents that had been contributed in that Vancouver conference. Then there was the Istanbul conference in 1996, for which is how I was recruited into Habitat to do some work for that. I think another milestone, and the Habitat Agenda, which I think is a very good document. How far it has remained in use as a document, I don't know, but I think the principles and the principles and policies that came out of the Habitat Agenda, I think have been used, whether governments, member states, or partners implement Habitat Agenda per se is one thing, but I think its influence is there. And there are some who have said that the Habitat Agenda tried to accommodate everybody, since of course it's a negotiated text, that it tried to be like everything to everybody, and in the end it ended up being just a wish list. I don't really agree with that, because I think the human settlements agenda is so big that the inclusiveness of the habitat agenda, I think is very important. Then there were the two campaigns on urban governance and security of tenure, which came out of one of the reorganizations of UN Habitat. And I think the interesting part about the campaigns was trying to mobilize around a specific thematic issue, and it sort of divided the work of UN Habitat into two focus blocks. The sort of soft aspects, which is the governance, and the hardcore, the security of tenure, which was about access to land, rights to not to be evicted, women's rights to land, for which I was working, by the way, quite a bit when I worked in the gender unit in cooperation with the department that was doing, the branch that was doing the secure tenure campaign. And I think it also helped because you realize that it is also difficult to separate work like that. So there are always things that cross. In other words, access to security of tenure in a lot of cases had to do with the governance situation. But I think still the campaigns help to focus in certain directions. I think one issue with the campaigns is I believe campaigns should have a timeline. I had worked before I came to UN Habitat, I had worked in UNICEF, which is sort of like very big on campaigns. And I think my experience from UNICEF was that a lot of the times the campaigns had a timeline, and you tried to achieve something by a certain date, and you use the campaign to mobilize around the content of the programming. I think in UN Habitat maybe we were a bit, the campaigns were not as sharply defined in terms of the timeline, and also how the programming, how the content of our work, how it was incorporated into the campaign, or how the campaign helped to push that. So that line was not very well defined. Then the next milestone I would say would be that Istanbul +5, which was the review of how far the habitat agenda had been implemented by member states. But it also led to, soon after that, we had the change of from Center, United Nations Center for Human Settlements to United Nations Human Settlements Program. I think that was a big thing. I think that was quite a big thing for us. And then I would say the other milestone would be the MDGs, and which was before Istanbul +5, before the MDGs and our assignment to Target 11 on reducing the number of slum dwellers by a certain period. And although there has been a lot of debate around that target and how useful it is as a target, whether it is not even ambitious enough, whether it is well defined enough, what exactly do you measure? I think it affected a lot the way the debate around it, I think, was important for the work of UN Habitat, for UN Habitat's mandate. But I think it was also important for how we looked at our data collection, because to be able to show whether member states are meeting that target, then I think how we defined data collection, how we helped in monitoring globally how things were going, and also how we engage with countries vis-a-vis help to data and information collection, and doing evidence-based policy and program making. I think that was quite important. I think times change, and I think any organization that needs to survive has to be always, even the private sector, have to be always reevaluating, restructuring, reinventing. And there was a time when our niche was that building, and then that was overtaken by things. We had, for example, another milestone was 2000, when we published the Global Strategy for Human Settlements, Global Strategy for Human settlements to the year 2000. No, but that one of the sort of policy shift in that global strategy was the government was seen as an enabler. The government as enabler, which was also a lot of debating. And then the role of UN Habitat was to enable government. So we were moving more and more into helping with monitoring global trends, in helping with policy formulation, and in setting global norms and principles and helping governments to interpret that. So I don't know whether anyone was the Habitat of that time and the Habitat of now is one is more effective than another one. I think it's just changing times, for which probably building houses on the ground is not the best thing that we can be doing. So then we do something more at another level. I think one of the biggest challenges, of course, right now is the economic crisis that affects our own financing of UN Habitat, but also affects what member states are also doing on the ground. So we give policies, we have programs, but then there are the challenges of implementing them. So that is one. I think another challenge, I think, is just the world politics at the moment. Insecurity is one thing, and natural and man-made disasters is another thing. But a lot of the insecurity has to do with politics. And even though human-made disasters can be very, 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 very devastating in a very short time, wide-scale earthquakes, tsunamis, whatever, I think the kind of disaster that is caused by bad politics, Syria, case in point, DR Congo, case in point, I think in terms of long-term challenges to human settlements development, I think those are potentially more difficult to deal with, which again also brings out this point about separating the interrelatedness of the governance and the sort of hardcore human settlements issues. How they can be overcome, I don't know that I have solutions to offer. One solution is, I have been working in the best practices program, is to look at solutions that others have used in other parts of the world. And for me, the best practices program for where I've been since 2002 has been very, very, very interesting, because it's like a window to the world. However, the purpose of the program is to help identify, collect, document, and disseminate and publicize best practices that are happening around the world, of course in the areas of UN Habitat's mandate. And best practices, that is a controversial terminology by itself. People are always questioning why best, better than what. But essentially we decided that the controversy itself was also useful. I mean, it helps to publicize. And the idea is we have a very simple criteria that has it had an impact? Has it involved partnerships between more than one sector? Has the initiative, is it sustainable? And sustainability, environmental, social, cultural, and also has it improved? Has it introduced innovation? And has it improved innovation either at the local level or in an overall level? And has it led to improved social inclusion, including gender mainstreaming? And how we collect the best practices, we use awards. In other words, the people document. If you have something very interesting, let's say on slum upgrading, we publicize an award, and we have several awards. We have the Dubai International Award for Best Practices to Improve the Living Environment, a very long title for an award, that has been going on since 1995, but then it is popularly known as the Dubai Award. Has been going on since 1995, and the first awards were actually given at the Istanbul conference in 1996. And every 2 years, we send out a call for these best practices, and it is, this award is sponsored by the Dubai municipality. And for every award cycle, we can get anything from 300 to 600 submissions. That has been the range. And so the awards are a motivation for organizations and governments and local governments to submit what they are doing. And what we do with those submissions, we have a standard format so that they are easy to review, but also to put in a database. And as long as our submission meets the minimum criteria that I've just mentioned, and as long as it is related to the work of UN Habitat, whether it ends up winning the award or not, it is put in a database because it has learning value. And we have a database now of more than 4,000 initiatives from around the world. I would say about 40% of them come from Latin America, about 20-something percent come from Africa, 20-something percent come from, no, 20-something percent come from Europe, and the rest of the percentage is divided between Asia and Africa. Latin America is represented in the database, but over the years we have had very few submissions from North America. We have not been able to figure out why, and this has historically been the case. And when we get submissions from North America, they are more likely to be from Canada than USA, which is probably an interesting research thing to follow up. In terms of who submits, most of the submissions are the vast majority are from local authorities and civil society actors, or a combination of an initiative that is between local government and the civil society actors, which is, again, is an interesting thing probably that we could follow up. National governments submit, but again, the percentage is very low. So these submissions are put in a database, and then we have sort of a judging process where between 10 and 12 win an award, a big award, and they go to Dubai and receive some cash. But the award really is the award is good for advocacy because it helps to publicize and to bring them to public light, and the winners usually tell you what winning means to them, how it helps to validate what they are doing, how it helps to publicize their work. Some of them may be working in a difficult political environment, and winning the award helps them with the local politics, and the winning has a lot of value for the winners. But even just being identified as a best practice and being put in the database also helps the initiatives. But the main thing is the learning and the lessons learned that we get from the awards. The other awards we have, one is called the Rafik Hariri Memorial Award, which is named after the late Rafik Hariri, who got a UN Habitat Scroll of Honor in 2004. Very unfortunately was assassinated 5 months later, and so his family approached UN Habitat and said they would like to start an award in his honor. The challenges of the best practices are, for me, there are three main ones. Once we have never had enough resources to actually do the documentation ourselves. So what is submitted is essentially self-documented. So there is a disparity between the very well documented ones and the not so well documented ones. And I usually like to classify, I sort of sometimes make a joke about it. I say that submissions fall into 3 categories. The people who are very good at selling and packaging themselves, but then there isn't too much substance in what they are submitting. The other end is the practice that is very good, but you can see that people have difficulties documenting it. And then there are the ones that have a good content, but are also reasonably well documented, which is the vast majority. I've had experience sometimes of visiting, sometimes when I'm on mission or just hear about a very good initiative. I encourage them to submit to the award, and then when the documentation arrives, I look at it and I say, what is this? I know that practice. They are not talking about this and they are not talking about this and they are not talking about the other. And sometimes I've taken the initiative to actually help submitters to improve the submission, but there's a limit to how much we can do that. We have a network of best practice partners around the world, but then they are by no means represented in all countries and all regions. So, for example, why we have such a big number of good submissions in the database form in Latin America is because we have a very good network of best practice partners in Latin America. So that is one of the challenges. Having the capacity to help documenters really do good documentation, and also validating, because you also need to be sure that what people are putting on paper is what is actually on the ground. Over the years, I must say, we have had a few challenges. I mean, every cycle we get, I think the maximum we have ever gotten was like three complaints saying we have seen this thing in your database and this is rubbish. We really hadn't have had much experience of that, but nonetheless, that is a challenge. And what was the third challenge? The third challenge is making maximum use of the knowledge that is gathered through those awards. We have the database, colleagues use them, we use them for the reports, like the global reports on human settlements, the State of the World Cities report, for examples, for boxes, for case books. But I think, again, we have not exploited enough the knowledge that is in that database. And that is partly a resource issue, partly, I don't know. Yes, I've been in all World Urban Forums. First one was in Nairobi in 2002. Then we went to Barcelona. Then we were in Vancouver. Vancouver, then Nanjing, then Rio. Then World Urban Forum. For me, there are two things I really like about the World Urban Forum. One thing is the equality of partners. Okay, governments will always be government, and the governments, because you always have to treat government with, give them the reverence that we expect. However, the World Urban Forum, you really have that feeling of the equality of partners. The Governing Council is for governments. The World Urban Forum is for everybody. And I think that level of exchange, I think, is very important. One level, it is quite structured, but at another level, is very unstructured. I think that combination is good. Combination of structure and no structure. I like that. Let me tell you, my two favorite World Urban Forums were, well, three favorite ones were Barcelona, and I think why I like Barcelona is the city is a very nice city, but two, there was the Forum of Cultures that was going on at the same time, and I think that even getting like the two crowds and having the cultural focus to an extent was interesting. Vancouver, I think so far, is my favorite World Urban Forum. A, it was very, very well organized. Two, it had very large numbers, but more importantly, for me, it was very clear that it was happening in a country that respects civil society and the input of civil society, in the way it was organized, in the way things were conducted. It just had a very, 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 very nice atmosphere of equality of partners. I think that is important to continue. Some of the challenges of the World Urban Forum, I think it's very difficult to report, to really distill, to capture sort of like what really is coming out of the World Urban Forum in order to feed it back to the work of UN Habitat. And I think that is something we just need to be working on all the time. Maybe we need a different kind of reporting. Maybe I know in the WOOF in Nanjing, which was one of the ones I didn't like too much, but for different reasons. Partly also because of that civil society. I felt that the civil society space was not as good as the civil society space in Vancouver. But in Nanjing, I know I have been in the reporting team of every World Urban Forum, which is at one level an interesting thing at another level, not very good, because you really don't get to interact with the wolf as much as possible, which is something I think the organizations needs to consider, that we need to rotate, yeah, to really have the same people stuck with report writing is a bit unfair. But then, yeah, once you get identified as a good reporting writer, too bad for you. But I think in Nanjing there was an attempt to actually see some of the highlights, some of the things that were coming out, some of the major things that are coming out, some of the trends that were emerging, what were the controversial issues and what were the issues that were somehow seems to have consensus. So I think that is one challenge, how to capture the essential conversation and how to reflect it in the work of UN Habitat. On the other hand, the wolf, just by its nature, this sort of equality of partners, just the fact that we have provided that space where people interact, I'm sure it has a lot of value that we can never, unless it was by some really sort of fancy research method, we could never really capture the value of the wolf on the ground. But I'm convinced that that interaction, that global marketplace of ideas on human settlements development, on urban development, I think is very important. Structuring governance is always, I think, is always a very political question. I would just like to say two things. I have been in restructuring before, in very major restructuring. And for me, the essential things about restructuring is that it must be very, very clear why a restructuring is happening. And I think in some of the restructuring that have happened in UN Habitat, it has been in some it has been more clear than others why we are doing restructuring. In other words, we just don't do restructuring for the sake of restructuring. B, it has to be participatory. And I think, again, I can say I have been in 3 different restructuring processes in UN Habitat. One was called revitalization, one was called regularization, as I have just said, and then there's the current one. And the 3 of them have had varying degrees of clarity as to why it was being done. I think the clarity as to why a restructuring is being done is very important. The participatory nature is very important. And again, there has been variation in how participatory each of them has been. And very important also, a reorganization process cannot take too long. Otherwise, energies dissipate, people are in limbo, and I think it's very bad for productivity and very bad for vision. So without pinpointing any particular one, I would say those are key issues. However, that done, I must say that the current one has really taken too long, and I think, in my honest view, I think that is a problem in terms of staff morale, in terms of productivity, in terms of even our partners and donors. It starts sort of giving clarity, lack of clarity now in what is our message if we are still restructuring. So that is as much as I'd like to say about restructuring. What I think the process should be like, I think it's very important that, again, the process should be participatory internally and externally. My experience from Habitat 2 and that Istanbul and Istanbul +5 is that the internal participation, I think, is very important. The external participation is very important. Habitat 2, for example, was hailed, I think, globally in the United Nations systems as having been very important in terms of incorporating partners' views and partners' inputs, in respect of partners' perspectives. And Habitat 2, for example, I think our interaction with the civil society partners, was very important for the debate on the rights-based approach to housing. And I think it's very important that for Habitat 3, we have the same sort of level or even better level, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of the respect, use that word, the respect we show for diversity. partners and by diversity of perspectives. In terms of the actual issues, I think the issues are pretty well known. But I think we also have to be mindful of what really we want the niche of UN Habitat to be, because we have a lot of other all sorts of organizations now, even in the UN system, that are very interested in the urban agenda. That I don't think is a problem. It's a good thing, but I think we also have to be mindful of what is going to be our relevance and what is going to be our niche, that it's sort of like our competitive edge in that arena. Some of the very low moments in UN Habitat have been to do with finances. There was a time when our finances were so bad that people were on 3-month contract, and like the longest, if you got a 6-month contract, you are very happy. And of course, that has a lot of implications for morale, for productivity, and even for planning. How do you plan? Do you do a program for 2 years when you don't know about the stuff? I think those have been very bad moments. Other bad times have been the scares. We have had several scares of being merged with UNEP and being moved to Europe and things like that. And on one occasion, I think quite serious, but we have gone over that. The restructuring processes at some point have had their problems, but I think we have managed to get over them. So, generally speaking, I think I've had a reasonably good experience working in UN Habitat. And yes, I would say we need to sort of define what is our niche, what is our cutting edge area, and run with that. They always have these emails that sort of go around saying, somebody has died and they are talking at their funeral, and nobody is saying they were coming to the office every day at 8 and leaving at 7. It's more how you interacted with people. I've had some really, really, really great colleagues, and not just for personally, but for work. I've done work with people. We have been on flex teams where we have been discussing a specific issue or a specific documents. I have gone on missions, for example, with colleagues on their work, for which they just wanted a different perspectives. As I've said, I work in the gender unit. I have worked very well with the Safer Cities program. I have had some really, really valuable interaction professionally and personally with colleagues throughout my 18 years in UN Habitat. One thing I think is data. I think we need to produce and develop and produce and highlight more sort of really cutting edge specific data that is sort of on the urban scene, on human settlements development, that is sort of like coming from nobody else, the kind of perspective that only UN Habitat can offer. What is our niche, what is our cutting edge area? And then I think the human settlements area is very, very important, and I think we need to realize that all the time, to remember that to know that we are working in a very important area, and but also to be mindful of possible threats to our mandate and our relevance in that mandate. I'm doing completely different things now. I write stories, I am doing family things, I'm catching up with the personal things that I haven't been able to do for a long time. For example, this week I am visiting my mother's friend of my late mother who is still alive. I'm doing things like that I have somehow neglected over the years. Just forget about books and EPAS and program and CPR and PRC, and and whatever.